Hi everyone and welcome to today's Biology Daily Booster. This is our first one for paper 2 and this is an advanced information topic for those of you doing foundation tier biology. Not explicitly listed on the higher tier, but that doesn't mean it's not coming up, as we well know by now. What we're going to be looking at then is the first bit of B4 today. And the first thing we need to do before we can really delve into this is to understand some of these key terminology that can come up on the paper. First one, the word ecosystem. This just refers to all of the living organisms and the physical conditions in an area. So when we talk about the ecosystem, it's not just the organisms, it's also those physical conditions as well. So light intensity, water, etc. Community are the organisms within the ecosystem. Habitat, the area in which those organisms live. Then we come on to a couple of words that link into our food chains work. Producers, these are organisms that make their own food by photosynthesis, plants, algae, etc. And then our consumers, these are organisms that do not make their own food. They have to eat other organisms to gain the energy they need to survive. And pretty much any animal you want to pick is an example of a consumer. The last word on there, decomposer, is just the type of organism that's going to gain its energy by feeding on either dead or decaying matter. So make sure you know these key terms first of all, and the best way to do it is flashcards, one side key term, on the back put the definition. You can literally just sit and test yourself then. If you're on the bus, a car ride, even just like walking to school, you can do a little bit of a test, obviously not when you're approaching the road. But when you're just walking along a pavement that's nice and straight with no issues, again, just quickly test yourself on a couple of them. That leads us really nicely onto our food chains. Now, food chains are something we should be really familiar with from lower down the school. Hopefully we remember that when we write a food chain, then we start off at the beginning with the producer. So in this case, our producer is kelp. We then have our first consumer, which we refer to as the primary consumer. Then we come along to the secondary consumer, and then we come to the tertiary consumer. So what we find here then is that we've got these different levels of consumers and producers. So all we've got, the producer is the one at the beginning of the food chain, always will be. Then we have our primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. Don't forget, the arrows in our food chain show the direction that the energy is flowing. So it has to go from the kelp to the sea urchin to the sea otter to the orca. If you put it the other way around, what you're really saying is that orcas are being eaten by sea otters because the energy will be going the other way. Not true. Arrows have to go from the producer to the primary consumer and so on. The ultimate source of all energy in a food chain is going to be the sun. Because as we said, our producers are going to make their own food using something like photosynthesis. Therefore, at the very beginning of everything, our energy comes from the sun. Now in our plants, those are going to take in that energy from the sun by using our chlorophyll. And then in the process of photosynthesis, they make glucose. Here's a bit of a throwback where we could see a link between paper 1 content and paper 2. Photosynthesis is obviously a paper 1 topic, but it could very easily come up with questions here. Word equation, carbon dioxide plus water makes glucose and oxygen. Balance symbol equation, 6CO2 plus 6H2O makes C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Once we've got our glucose here, it doesn't just stay as glucose. We will change it into things like our carbohydrates, the proteins, etc. So what we're really doing is we're building up other molecules. Now, if they ask us what happens in our food chain, so how we actually pass this energy through a food chain, we can talk about photosynthesis in our producers first of all, builds the plant's biomass, and then if you literally say that the consumer eats the plant or feeds on the plant, and therefore proteins are passed along from the plants to the animals, you've got those marks. One point worth noting, not all of the energy is going to end up being passed from one stage to the next. Some of it is always going to be lost in the process of respiration, because respiration happens in all living cells, all the time. Therefore, we will lose a certain proportion of our energy due to respiration. We mentioned this word biomass. When we talk about biomass, we're just referring to the amount of living material present within an organism. So what we've actually got here is just the amount of stuff that it's made of when we remove the water, basically. Now, what we actually find in our food chains shows what eats what. The arrow shows the direction of our energy flow, so remember, always from the producer to the consumer. And we've got these things called trophic levels. Now, trophic levels, quite simply, is a feeding level. So it shows the position of an organism in that food chain, or if we've built several food chains together, into a food web. Because food webs show all those linked food chains in the habitat. Now, when we actually see these food webs, what you're going to find is you'll have your producer down at the bottom. You'll then have our next level with our primary consumers, and there could be two different ones. We'll then come up to the secondary consumer, and they both might eat that same primary consumer. But here is our first trophic level with the producer, second trophic level with the primary consumer, third trophic level with the secondary consumer. So what we have there are just the different feeding levels. They can ask you to name an organism from a particular trophic level. We always start at the bottom with the producer, that's our first trophic level, and then each one building up is a new level. We now need to understand a couple of different factors that can come into play as far as organisms in habitats go. The first one is the term biotic factor. Now, biotic, if we break it down, bio means living, so these are the living factors. Good examples here, the number of organisms we find, what organisms we find, competition between organisms. This is all to do with some kind of living organism and how it's interacting. Second option, the abiotic factors. These are non-living factors, the physical ones. Temperature, pH, light intensity, all of those are abiotic, non-living factors. If we have a little look at how some of these abiotic factors can affect basically what lives in a certain place. If we go for light first of all, hopefully this is quite an obvious one. Light is needed for photosynthesis. The greater the amount of light available, the greater the success of the plant. That doesn't mean that plants are incapable of growing in areas with a lower light intensity. They've just become adapted. So what we actually find is those plants that are designed to grow in these low light intensities tend to have much larger leaves in order to actually trap as much of the light that arrives in that shaded area as possible. Second factor, temperature. The way that temperature affects things is because it affects the enzymes that control all of those different metabolic reactions. Now, if we have a warm temperature, then that's going to aid this rapid development because it's warm enough for the enzymes to have more frequent collisions, and therefore we're going to see faster metabolic reactions. It's also worth remembering there are some organisms that don't have an ability to basically warm their own blood. These are our ectotherms, like lizards. So in order to actually warm up enough to start off all these metabolic processes really getting going, they've got to sit somewhere nice and warm and toasty in the sun to then warm their body from outside. So temperature will have an effect on the activity of things like those ectotherms. Third one, the amount of water. Lack of water is just going to lead to death. Think about our plants. If they've got a lack of water, they wilt. Reason for that, because the cells have lost their turgidity and therefore the whole thing kind of collapses. Final factor is pH. Now, pH is all about the availability of different minerals in the soil and biological activity in soil. So different pHs will actually affect what minerals are available in the first place and what can live in the different soils. You probably know that you can't grow every single plant you want in your garden because the soil pH is going to determine what does well and what's just a bit rubbish. So if you've got acidic soil, growing things like rhododendrons, it's brilliant, they do very well there. If you're alkaline soil, cauliflowers and cucumbers are going to thrive. And there's one weird little plant, hydrangea, which actually is quite a good indicator of the colour of the soil based on the colour of the flowers. Because if it's growing in pH 7 soil, then it's this deep pink colour. If it's growing in quite acidic soil, down to the pH 4.5 to 5, it's actually a blue colour flower you get. So depending on the pH of your soil, determines the colour of the flowers on the hydrangea. You do need to know the bits of equipment we can use to measure these different abiotic factors in an investigation. So light intensity, we use a light meter. Moisture, a humidity sensor. pH, a pH probe. And temperature, hopefully we all know this one, a thermometer. Obviously, if there are some bits from today that you want to go over in a little bit more detail, there are the videos that are on the main channel. You can also obviously use your revision guides, your classwork notes, and of course I do recommend having a look at some of the paper 2 biology papers in advance of the exam. You can get all of those on the OCR website. Have a look at the style of questions, double check the mark scheme to see where the marks were awarded. And of course, don't forget to join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Booster for biology.